Hello whisky fans, I want to start this video off by saying this is not a review. There will be no whisky consumed in this review, apart from this bit. This is a video for the real whisky geeks out there. This is going to be a video about the new regulations coming into force for Japanese whisky. If you really couldn't care less about such things, then probably take a look at one of the other videos. But for everyone else, let's get your geek on. Some of you might be aware that there's some new rules coming into force for Japanese whisky, and these have been set out by the JSLMA, the Japan Spirits and Liqueur Makers Association. So me personally, I love Japanese whisky. I have done for a long time. I do think that it's gone downhill in recent years since Japanese whisky has really come to the forefront of everyone's attention and everyone's been buying it. Sadly, the price has just skyrocketed, and I think these days very few of us are actually able to buy the really good stuff readily at a fair price anymore. But thinking back to the good days when you can get a bottle of Yoichi 12-year-old or Miyazaki 12 or Yamazaki or the Hakushu 12, which I absolutely loved. You used to be able to get those for around £30 a bottle here in the UK, and these days you're probably looking at plus 100 on top of that price, if you can even find it at all. So sad times, and obviously the distilleries are businesses, and they've had to respond to the fact that their stocks assumedly have probably been absolutely run dry, and they've replaced a lot of their offerings with no age statement whiskies, which some of them are okay-ish, but generally Japanese whisky is not what it was. But hopefully all these things are going to be a thing of the past at some point, and we're going to get back to the glory days. And I think what's happening at the moment is probably partially a cause of these new regulations that are coming in. Because until recently, Japanese whisky has been a little bit of the Wild West of the spirits world. It's not quite as bad as some other spirits, but it's been very loosely regulated. The current regulations for Japanese whisky date all the way back to the 1950s, with a minor update in the 1980s. So even those updates in the 80s are now 40 years old, or more than. And those regulations were only really ever concerned with tax collection and things like that, so we never really had anything that guaranteed the quality of Japanese whisky and assured the consumer of what they were actually getting when they bought Japanese whisky. The main problems at the moment with Japanese whisky before these regulations, the country of origin was never set in stone, so a lot of you will probably be aware that there's been several problems in the past where whisky has actually been sourced from other countries. Notably, some Japanese whisky has been sold which has possibly been Scotch, or at least blended with Scotch whisky, and because there's no law in Japan that prohibits this, it's okay and they don't have to declare it on the label, and a lot of us here in the wider world who have bought Japanese whisky at a premium may have been drinking Scotch. Another problem with Japanese whisky until recently is the actual ingredients used. Now, with Scotch, and with American whiskies, we are spoiled because with Scotch we know that if it's a single malt, it's going to be entirely malted barley. And if it's a bourbon, we at least know that it's going to be 51% corn, or a rye whiskey, and we know it's going to be at least 51% rye. But with Japanese whisky, they can use, up until now, they could have used any grain or any raw material that they chose to. So when you buy a Japanese single malt, it doesn't necessarily mean as much when you see the word single malt on the label as it might do if you buy a Scotch whisky. Now, another problem with Japanese whisky is the age statements. And again, in the Western world, we're spoilt by this assumption that all Scotch and bourbon, if it says, for example, 12 years old on the label, that means that the youngest spirit in that bottle is at least 12 years old. With Japanese whiskey, there is, again, nothing set down in stone, nothing legal, so they could actually bend the interpretation of that, and there may actually be younger spirit in the bottle. Now, I've got no evidence to believe that's the case, but without it being set down in law, we don't know. So it's clear that there is a need for some tight regulations when it comes to Japanese whiskey. So let's just take a look at what they're proposing to bring in. So these rules coming from the Japan Spirits and Liqueur Makers Association, they are coming into effect on the 1st of April 2021, and they will retroactively apply to all whiskey labelled as Japanese whiskey as of 2024. And the main things that I can see, the main applicable stuff, the meat of it, the new rules will state that saccharification, that's a fancy word, fermentation and distillation must be done at a Japanese distillery. So saccharification, we can pretty much interpret that as mashing, so it's converting starches into fermentable sugars, which is interesting because I don't believe that, at least in Scotch whiskey, I don't think there's anything saying that the mashing actually has to be done on site at the distillery. With Scotch whiskey at the moment, you could have everything up to distillation happening off-site, possibly by a different company, and as long as you distill the whiskey at the distillery and it's matured in Scotland, not necessarily at the distillery, that's fine. So what they're actually proposing there is actually a little bit tighter than the rules that affect Scotch. And obviously, if those rules do go into force, that's going to put an end to any Japanese distillery importing Scotch or Irish or bourbon or anything else and labelling it as Japanese whiskey. So that's a good thing. The new rules will also stipulate that the spirit has to be distilled to no less than 95% ABV before it goes into the cask. So this is pretty much the same as the rules that affect Scotch whiskey. Scotch whiskey can actually be distilled to 94.8% ABV before it goes into the cask. And the reason for that is if you distill the spirit to really high strengths, you end up with such a strong spirit that even if you put it into the cask for a proper maturation period, it comes out basically the same as it went in. To actually get a proper maturation and pick up some flavours from the cask, it's necessary to put the spirit into the cask at a slightly lower ABV. Now, Scotch law specifies 94.8. Almost always, Scotch whisky will go into the cask at 70 or lower. So the new rules for Japanese whiskey, there's a little bit of leeway to make something really light and bland, potentially a lower quality, very neutral product, but the rules are basically the same as they are for Scotch, and there's a generous tolerance there, but it prevents people from making something that's cheap as chips and almost completely neutral and saying it's Japanese whiskey. So again, that's pretty much a good thing. New rules also specify that the whiskey must be bottled at no less than 40%. So again, that's the same as here in the UK for Scotch whiskey, and I believe the same as for American whiskey. But the new rules for Japanese whiskey do say that bottling has to be done inside Japan. Now, I know that this doesn't apply for American whiskey, because some American whiskey sold by Lidl here in the UK, I know is bottled in Germany. So it's interesting that the Japanese have decided that bottling has to happen in Japan as well, and it makes you wonder if they've done that because they want every step of the process to be under the control of the Japan Spirits Liqueur Makers Association. They want to be able to keep a close eye on everything to make sure that nothing untoward happens, perhaps. The spirit has to be aged in Japan in casks no larger than 700 litres for 3 years. So that's exactly the same as what we have for Scotch at the moment, 700 litre casks. You can imagine if you didn't have an upper size limit on the casks, you could essentially age the whiskey in a wooden swimming pool, and there'd be so little contact with the wood that it would come out with no cask influence at all. and 3 years old, exactly the same as we have for Scotch whisky. So again, a good thing. The rules also specify that a whisky can't be labelled Japanese style or Japanese type. Also, no mention of Japanese cities, regions, landmarks, or people who evoke Japan on the label. So if it's not a Japanese whisky, basically don't trick people into thinking that it is. There are some other rules that are coming in this new Japanese regulations that seem a little bit odd. They specify that malted grain must be used, so you think similar to what you have with single malt Scotch whisky. But it then goes on to say that they can use other cereal grain. So that makes you think that they have to use some malted grain, probably barley, but they don't have to. So if there's 1 grain of malted barley in the mash bill, that makes it acceptable to call it Japanese whisky, even if the rest is made up of rice or maize, sweet corn, rye, whatever you want. So that seems a little bit odd. And I don't know what the mash bills are for Japanese whisky at the moment, but under these new regulations, that opens them up to making something like a Japanese version of an Irish pot still whisky, and that would still be okay to label as Japanese whisky. Another odd rule is that they specify that the water itself must be Japanese. Why that would be, I'm not sure. If the Japanese think that their water is better than everyone else's, perhaps it is. And lastly, something that upset me a little bit, E150 plain caramel can be used. So probably almost everyone watching this, at least if you've stayed with me up to this point, you'll know what E150 plain caramel or spirit caramel is. It's burnt sugar. And with Scotch whisky, it's a legal additive. It's one of 2 things, spirit caramel for colouring, or water that can be added to a whisky when it's bottled. And E150 plain caramel is the work of the devil, because it has no positive effect on a whisky, and if you add enough, or if you add it to a quality craft presentation whisky, you absolutely can taste it. It does have a negative effect on whisky, and the only reason for it in Scotch whisky, a lot of Scotch distilleries say that they've always done it, so it's traditional, so they should be continued to allow to do it. But I think most of us think that it's very underhanded, and it's condescending to think that the customer needs to be shown a repeatable presentation of a whisky, or they'll think that something's wrong. In my opinion, it's very condescending and it's very underhanded, and I'm really disappointed that when they've drafted up these regulations for Japanese whisky, they haven't stamped that out right now to stop it becoming a blot on Japanese whisky as it is with Scotch whisky. A little aside, American whisky is not allowed to have spirit caramel added, and that's fantastic. Hats off to you, USA, you're doing a great job there, much better than we are here in the UK. So, is there anything missing from these new regulations? Well, I did think it was a bit strange that they don't tie down the ingredients a little bit tighter. It would have probably been nice if they'd have specified malted barley only, because it works perfectly well for Scotch whisky, and in my opinion, Japanese whisky is more or less in a Scotch style, definitely closer to a Scotch style than it is an American whisky, or probably any other type of whisky. But you can also understand if the Japanese distilleries are using other materials at the moment, then it's only fair that you allow them to continue to do what is traditional. They also don't specify in these new regulations whether the stills have to be pot stills or if continuous stills are allowed to be used. So in the UK, if you produce a whisky using column stills, that would end up having to be labelled as either a single grain or a blended grain or a blended Scotch. But with these new regulations in Japan, it doesn't prohibit any of that, and from what I can see, they can do whatever they want, use whatever type of stills they like, and still call it Japanese whisky. Again, I don't know if that's the case, that's what they're doing at the moment, but they haven't decided to specify pot stills. Another worrying omission from these new regulations is that they haven't tied down anything to do with the age statement beyond the fact that it has to be aged for 3 years in Japan. Now, that sounds fine, but you have to consider the problems that you have with some other spirits. Like, some people will probably be saying, oh, why do we need these regulations? But if you look at a spirit like rum, you can buy a bottle of rum that may have 5 years on the front of the label, and there's no legal definition of what that 5 has to mean. That could be the youngest rum in that bottle has to be at least 5 years old, or it could be the oldest rum in that bottle, or it could be an average age, or it could even be stretched as far as to say that the rum in the bottle tastes like a rum which is roughly 5 years old. And because there's nothing in these new Japanese regulations that says that the age statement has to pertain to the youngest whiskey in the bottle, that leaves them wide open to abuse of the age statements as well. And finally, one more loophole that they've seemed to have left open: all of these rules only apply to companies that subscribe to the Japan Spirits and Liqueur Makers Association's rules. So that's as dodgy as it sounds like. These regulations, from what I can see, aren't actually going to be Japanese law. They're just regulations set out by JSLMA, and anyone that doesn't follow the regulations set down by this association is free to break them in whatever way it wants to. Now, that shouldn't be too much of a problem, because almost all of the whiskey makers in Japan are subscribed to the JSLMA, so it shouldn't be an issue. But if any of them decide to leave the association, or if any new distilleries pop up that choose not to join the association, they're free to do whatever they want. One more thing that I personally would have been a nice little addition to all of this is, as I said, there's no differentiation in these Japanese regulations between what the Scottish would call a single malt or a blended malt or a blended Scotch. And bearing in mind that so many of these Japanese whiskey manufacturers are struggling to meet demand, it would have been nice to introduce a lesser category that could come under the label of Japanese whiskey, but maybe a subcategory. So something like how we have blended Scotch here in the UK, which still counts as Scotch because it's got Scotch in the name, but it's a defined... Try not to all lynch me here, but I'm going to say that blended Scotch is a lesser category of Scotch whiskey. It would be nice to have something like that in Japanese whiskey. So it would allow the Japanese whiskey manufacturers to shift volume to the consumers that want something at a lower price point, perhaps that could be maybe less than 3 years old, or it could be distilled at a higher proof, so it comes out as a more neutral spirit. Something like that. It might allow the whiskey manufacturers to keep up and still reserve the good stuff, the Japanese single malt, to put into bottlings for the real whiskey connoisseurs. Hopefully that's something that they might look at in the future, and something that might be able to improve the situation and get the Japanese whiskies that all of us whiskey geeks know and love back up to where they were. Either way, it'll be interesting to see over the next few months which distilleries decide to change their products. I'm expecting that some Japanese whiskies may be withdrawn from the market and may be replaced with something else, and some distilleries may even choose to take the phrase Japanese whiskey off of their labels and market it as something else. I expect that the majority of them will change their products to follow these guidelines, but time will tell. We'll have to see what happens. So let me know in the comments what you've thought of this video, and if you want to see any more real whiskey geek videos out there, or if you just want to see me drink loads of whiskey and do more whiskey reviews. Hopefully some of you enjoyed this and some of you have got something out of it. Let me know, and I'll see you next time. Thanks for watching.